So I'm here with Chardé Hollins, founder and CEO of Relevant Connections. She's on a mission to create safe spaces for those hard conversations. How are you doing? How did you come about starting Relevant Connections?
Very good question. So I have a background as a licensed clinical social worker. So I worked in schools and different trauma-affected communities and really saw that there was a need for culturally competent care. So many times there's a stigma within Black and Brown communities about behavioral health, and that stigma was being decreased by education. However, once we were educated, there wasn't really spaces for us to receive care that identified with our culture. And so that was really frustrating for me as a clinician. And so I decided to start Relevant Connections in order to provide opportunities for people to learn how to become culturally competent in order to better support minority populations, because we deserve to have providers, educators, clinicians who know how to support Black and Brown individuals as well.
Why do you feel there is a stigma in Black and Brown communities about mental health care?
Because we're often taught to be strong, and that word strong is defined as not having problems, and that's really not the definition of strength. And so because we have defined it as that, we now tie the fact of going to receive help as a negative, when really receiving help is a form of strength. So part of destigmatizing mental health within the Black and Brown community is by redefining what strength is. And that's what's so important.
Wow, yeah, and you do so much great work in the community. I was like looking you up online. And I saw this speech you did where you talked about the impact of diverse experiences on brain development. I was I was really like blown away by that. Can you talk about how the brain development and adverse experiences affected?
Absolutely. So when we talk about the brain development, it develops the most within the first 3 years of our lives. And when we think about where we are in the first 3 years of our lives, we're at home, we're with our parents, we're not in school. And so how it is that we are treated and how it is that we engage with our children at such a young age is so important, because that is exactly when their brain is developing. In the same regard, if people are if they are raised in a community where there is a lot of violence or trauma, or there's different things that yelling, screaming, or just different things that can be negative in regards to their personality and their space, that is an impact on their brain. And it actually sends a signal to them that says that they're constantly in danger, constantly in danger. And so what happens is that that signal stays raised for a very long time until they grow up, and in their mind they are constantly in danger. And that's what you kind of hear when people say PTSD. It's when something has happened to you and you're consistently believing that it is still happening or it will happen again, and therefore it affects the way in which you're able to engage with people. And that happens, and when it does, it slows down the way that the cognitive piece of the brain works, and rather than the instinct. So we have people who have been impacted by trauma at a young age. When their brain was developing, they're very quick on instinct because they're impulsive, they have to survive, right? But they are delayed when it comes to cognitively thinking and making positive decisions, because they needed to survive when they were younger rather than think things through. So it definitely has a long-term effect during those first 3 years of your life.
Wow, that's very enlightening. You think of PTSD, mainly affecting like older people, like when you hear about veterans or women who are in domestic violence situations, like those are all situations that affect like Black and Brown communities. Can you kind of speak to that?
Yes. And so when we talk about those who are within veterans and those who are in domestic violence situations, those are actually really good examples, because oftentimes there are modalities in order to support them. We've studied them. We've been able to say, hey, these are some treatments or these are some services that are available. But in regards, what we have not done is look at young people within the Black and Brown community who are exposed to violence. every single day. And they actually have a higher percent of PTSD than someone who's in combat war. And so it's like, wow, the statistics are telling us that our young people between the ages of 13 to 25 actually have a higher response of trauma than a veteran in combat war because of the violence that's happening in our country. And so the difference is that the way that they're responding is it's current trauma. It's not really PTSD because it's currently happening every day, right? So we have to figure out what are some strategies we can do in order to support a population that's currently experienced traumatic events.
No, I could 100% see that. I live in Chicago, and like you hear it all through the music. Like that
Yeah.
these kids make. I think like it's a reflection of the violence in the city. Uh, what do you think like about like pop culture and the way like like they kind of like seemingly like promote unhealthy lifestyle sometimes, not all the time, but
No, I do feel as though when we're listening to lyrics and stories, they definitely can be perceived as highlighting a violent lifestyle or a lifestyle of the streets. However, if you really dive into it and work with individuals who are within that community, it was a relief for them. There's a lot of times when they're talking and you really look at the words, they're talking about a traumatic experience and how they got through it. And so, as a clinician, when I worked with incarcerated juveniles, I actually utilized the pop culture and played songs and tied it to our curriculum for cognitive behavioral therapy. Because what it did is it sparked conversation. How is it that with this lyric or with this song that does speak about a shootout? It does speak about the fact that somebody died or they had to actually harm someone else. How do you relate to that and what were you going through? And so now we can utilize those types of things to bridge the gap and be able to provide culturally competent and relevant treatments for our young people.
wow, like, you're doing so much incredible work. You know, you do a lot of work like with diversity. That's a word like I kind of pondered what it really means sometimes,
Mhm.
because when I went to college I got a diversity scholarship. Like, it was a long time ago, and then like my senior year they told me like they took the scholarship away because they were like I no longer represented diversity at that particular institution. So what does diversity actually mean, and why is it important?
Very good question. I think what is important is diversity within context, right? So usually when people talk about diversity, it's diversity, equity, and inclusion, that DEI, and all three are very important. So diversity in it of itself is defined as differences, something that has differences, right? And so of course, technically anything can be diverse. And so with that being said, it's but standing by itself, it is not impactful and it is not special, just to be honest, because everybody has something that is different or diverse about them. But that is why the inclusion and the equity is also important to the factor. So when we talk about inclusion and equity, inclusion is allows you to be a part of the conversation because of the things that are different about you. And equity allows you to feel comfortable and to be proud of the things that are different about you while you're included in the conversation. So it's very important that all three exist and that will lead to cultural humility so that we can definitely dismantle some racist institutions.
Speaking of racist institutions, the Oscars recently occurred. Some
Yeah.
people are like upset because, Angela Bassett, she did that phenomenal performance and she was overlooked, for the Oscar by Jamie Lee Curtis. But like, there's also people who point out that the Oscars, like, showcase a lot of death and diversity and inclusion because, there were like other racial groups that won awards that don't normally win awards.
Yeah. Yes, and that's once again when we talk about diversity, it's something that's different. And so in their regard, they could say that they were diverse because there were others of ethnic populations that did win. And for that reason, they're able to check off the box of them meeting the quota of whatever they may have had.
Most definitely. One of the biggest, goals of I think the Biden administration has placed equity and racial justice among its, highest priorities. From my perspective, the world doesn't seem any better for people of color, specifically, than it was under the Trump administration. And I could certainly make the argument that things are getting worse. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I believe that oftentimes, unfortunately, the Black community is forced to support others before we are supported. And many times, when there's conversations that are happening about improving the lives of the Black community, oftentimes it's overshadowed by talking about everyone else. And so everyone else is able to get some type of support or some type of initiative that is written and that produces equity. However, the Black community seems to always be the ones on the back end that just simply get lip service. And so what people don't understand that would actually shift equity within the nation is if Black people actually were to receive the things that they deserve. And the reason is because we are last at this moment. And once you push forward and give Blacks um, the access and the things that are necessary, you'll find that other people are able to now bridge that gap as well too. And so I agree in a sense that unfortunately we've been given a lot of lip service rather than the actual policies and implementations that are needed in order to truly become equitable.
What do you think would be some solutions to make life more equitable for people of color?
Well, in a perfect world, I do believe that reparations are important. I mean, that's just when we talk about different populations that have experienced historical trauma from our Native Americans, the Jewish culture, things of that nature. They have received, in some regards, some form of reparations, however you want to list it, right? There is something that is attached to their ethnicity that has set them apart in a positive way because of the trauma that they've experienced. Black community does not have that. Those who are descendants of slaves do not have something that's tied to them that now allows them to be set apart in a positive way because of the trauma they experienced. We're just set apart in a negative way because of our history. And so being able to kind of figure out, well, what does it look like to truly give free education or to truly give, your 10 acres and a mule or whatever that case may be, where we have this ancestry.com and all of these things that talk about lineage and really following it back and saying, well, if I'm able to find that I was attached to so and so, what is it that can happen in order for us to be able to receive benefit from that generational wealth? But I definitely feel like there's things that should be done that pushes us forward beyond the generations that were behind us because we're behind. We're so far behind.
You make up some really valid points. And, I think of like, schools like Harvard, and they have like, like a billion, multi-billion dollar endowment. And, it was built by slaves,
Yes.
and a lot of like, institutions, the White House was built by slaves. And like, there hasn't been like, reparations. I could see like, but I think it would be really hard to allocate who should get reparations, because like even like being a descendant of slavery, like, there's some people and stuff that like, they're probably a descendant of slaves, but they're also descendants of slave owners. So like, should they really receive reparations as well? I think that's a difficult conversation.
Well, yes, but you also have to think if they're descendants of slave owners that and they were descendants of slaves, then they were a product of someone being victimized, which means that they should even more so receive something because we know that there was definitely a rape culture during the slavery time where the slave masters were sleeping with the slaves and not because it was consented. So even more so of why these reparations are important. I do totally agree that, passing out a check to everybody is just doesn't make sense, but that's why policy is important. What does it look like for policy in regards to education and being able to apply to certain schools and being able to get a degree? Because just broadly thinking, the United States, when it comes to education, can truly give everybody a free education if they wanted to, right? Because we are a nation that is very wealthy. So, in that regard, what could it look like as a part of reparations to give free education to descendants of slaves?
But don't you feel like everyone has the ability to get a free education now, especially with the internet? Like I think about things like, Khan Academy. You can pretty much go online, learn any like skill. If you struggle in geometry or calculus, there's videos that you can watch and you can become, competent in those skills.
Yeah, but all of those things are tied to privilege. So in order for someone to have access to internet, in order for someone to have access to be able to comprehend whatever system it is, that's all out of a lens of privilege. And so knowing that many of those who are mostly in need, they don't have that lens of privilege. So that wouldn't be beneficial to them, rather than for someone like myself who would be considered educated and middle class, that would just make sense, right? But we're not talking necessarily about those in that regard. We're talking about those who definitely need more support in moving forward.
Definitely. Chardé, like what's next for you?
What's next for me is continuing to create safe spaces for meaningful conversations, supporting individuals and organizations and being able to talk about mental health and equity and how to mold it into their everyday systems, because it is not separate. It is truly together, because mental health is physical health. And oftentimes people talk about physical health without mentioning the importance of mental wellness also. So I want to make sure that I'm helping them bridge the gap and move forward in holistic wellness.
Thank you so much, Chardé, for taking the time. I really appreciate you.
Same.